Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here at God, Where Were You When? I am your host, Chandronette Mobley, and today's guest is the awesome Miss Lonnie Lane.
Hello, how are you? It's nice to be on your show.
Thank you for joining us on the show today.
My
Even
pleasure.
though the weather is kind of dreary, we're still going to have an awesome time on the show today. So let's go ahead and get right into it. You are a Jewish believer in Yeshua Jesus, correct?
Correct.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to know the Lord?
Well, my background is totally Jewish. I mean, I was just so completely Jewish that even though there were Gentiles around me, we really didn't pay any attention. I mean, my school closed down on Jewish holidays, so we were just plain Jewish. And I had every Sabbath at my grandmother's every Friday night and all the holidays. And so I really didn't pay attention to what was going on in the Christian world. That was about them. We were us and they were them. But then I had an experience. I had gone to Israel with my rabbi and the synagogue, and I had an experience of what felt like Jesus following me around. I didn't even know he was alive. I mean, Jesus is following me around. I felt like if I turn around real quick, he would catch him, but he always ducked behind a wall or something. I was just aware of him. And then he followed me home, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't make him go away. And so there was about a year, 2 years maybe, of trying to figure out what do I do with this Jesus. And so I started taking some classes in comparative religion and found out that Christianity was Jewish in its foundation. I actually did not know that. I knew that Jesus had been Jewish. It's a kind of had been. He used to be. How did he leave us? But I didn't know the apostles were and all this. And so there were a lot of supernatural things that happened. They're all in my book that's called Because They Never Asked. Okay. But finally, one day I just heard his voice audibly. I used to ask my rabbi, how come we don't hear from God anymore? Why did he speak to Moses and he spoke to Abraham and he spoke to David, but he doesn't speak to us? And he thought it was crazy that I even wanted to ask. But then I heard him speak to me one day, and he only said one word, which was listen. And that one word in Hebrew is Shema, which is the beginning of the most prayed prayer of Jewish people in the world for the last 2,000 years. And so I listened, but what I heard in that one word, you know how you can tell if they call you on the phone, you can tell if they're young or they're old or they're happy or they're sad. And
right.
I heard all the authority, like unchallengeable authority, and at the same time, such tenderness, all in that word. And I had such a peace come over me as I've never had before, since it was just not of this world. And I knew that I met my Messiah because the voice I heard was that of a 30-something-year-old.
Wow.
And I got saved right there on the spot, and that was many, many years ago, and he's been with me every day since.
That's an awesome story. And I'm kind of paying attention to your earrings. Are those Jewish stars on your ears?
Yes, they're a friend of mine made them for me. They're Stars of David, yes.
Okay, awesome. Stars of David. Okay. Very
Jewish stars. Jewish stars will work.
Okay. Okay. Now, I do want to ask you, is there like a tug of war, or maybe like, I know with Muslims, sometimes if they transition over to Christianity, they feel ostracized. Is there anything like that with the Jewish community?
Oh, yeah, I would say so. Yes, I lost my synagogue friends and my family that I used to have Shabbat with, the Sabbath with every Friday. They just stopped talking to me. They didn't know how to talk to me. Okay. And so the reason I wrote that book that I mentioned, which was many years later, I felt like the Lord wanted me to write it. And because they never asked me, why Jesus? How come? What happened? So I wrote the book, which is why I called it Because They Never Asked, because that's why I wrote the book. But yes, it was quite costly, but I was so excited about him and so enthralled that I was just, it wasn't that painful at the time.
Right now, and listening to your testimony that you just gave, I'm sure you gave them the same one, right? So they did.
No, we never got that far that they would even hear me.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's deep. So with your transition, going from your Jewish faith and then into a believer or Christ Christianity, the Messiah, you probably started going to church.
Yes.
Now, how did that differ for you?
Well, first I read the New Testament, and even going into a Christian bookstore and buying the book, a Bible, it seemed so alien to me. It was just really hard adjustment, and so when I finally went to church after I read the New Testament, I went with an expectation that the Gentiles were keeping a lot of things from us, that it really was Jewish, because after all, Jesus, Paul, the apostles, they go to the temple, they keep the Sabbath, they keep all the feasts, they're Jewish. It's a very Jewish book, and well, I think most Gentiles don't read it that way. To me, it was all familiar. And so when I went to church, it was a shock to me, because what happened to my feasts? What happened to Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and Passover? Where were those things? And what they were keeping instead was what I knew were two pagan holidays, Christmas and Easter. And they are pagan holidays. Jesus wasn't born on Christmas. And what happened to Passover that Easter, took over? And so that was the beginning, but there were so many other things, because I had also heard, because I heard the Lord's voice. I mean, it was like no other voice when I got saved. But I was told by one of my elders that that Jesus doesn't talk. God doesn't talk to us anymore. I was just told that God doesn't speak to us anymore. Once we had the Bible, that He didn't speak. But I got saved that way. So I had a lot of conflicts that I thought were just not in keeping with the New Testament.
Okay. Wow. So what were those things that were different? Do you have anything specific that you felt like was alien in the New Testament?
I felt like the New Testament wasn't really alien to me, except for I had to get used to Jesus being the Messiah. But He was so Jewish that wasn't what was alien. What was alien is what was going on in the church.
Do you want to talk about?
Well, for one thing, I kept talking to Him, and I loved talking to Him and being with Him. I was so excited that I could actually have a conversation with God. And I remember one day sitting in my bed, and I had already said everything I could think of to say to Him 3 times. And I thought by now He must be bored. So I said, I've heard about this prayer language. I don't know what it is. But everything was such a miracle to me. It was so all new to me that this wasn't any more of a miracle than everything else. And I said, if there's a prayer language that I could have that would enable me to commune with you more, could I have it? And I had read a book that said, tongues is for everybody. It's a prayer language. Open your mouth and don't speak in English. And I thought, well, how in the world do you do that? But I did it, and there it was, and I've got a prayer language now. So I went to church that Sunday, and I had told Mr. Ritchie, who was a nice man from Scotland, and that God had given me a prayer language, and I thought he'd be as excited about it as I was. And he said, oh, no, lassie, you can't be using that language. You could be from the devil. You could be cursing God. And so, there were just so many. How could this be the same God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever? And they're telling me that He's changed. Things aren't the same. Very confusing. Right.
Now, especially when it comes to the Pentecost that happened in the New Testament, correct? And then you're hearing they're talking about the Holy Spirit coming in like a mighty rushing wind, and that they all spoke in tongues. So you were feeling like, okay, if this is happening in the New Testament, I should be a part of this. And you were allowed to engage in that in your spiritual walk and in the church.
Exactly.
Wow.
So when I tell people things like, the people of the New Testament didn't have a New Testament. They had an Old Testament.
They had the
and they had the experience of. They didn't think of being Christian. There was no Christian. There was no Christianity. There was no divorce from all the things that were Jewish.
Right.
so, you know, there's a verse that Peter spoke at Pentecost, since you mentioned Pentecost, which is really a Jewish holiday called Shavuot. And
Can you repeat that again?
Shavuot, which is
Shavuot.
Shavuot is a Jewish holiday that we call Pentecost. And God had ordered ordained that 3 of the Jewish feasts would require that the men came up to Jerusalem. And so that's why there were all those people in Jerusalem during that Pentecost time, because that's the Gentile word for it, is Pentecost. And so one of the things, that's when 3,000 Jewish people came to the Lord that day. And one of the things that Peter said, which has become kind of a light verse for me, was that Yeshua, that's his real name, Jesus' real name, he never heard the word Jesus, is withheld in heaven until the restoration of all things as spoken by the prophets from the beginning.
Okay.
And I don't think I saw that verse until maybe a couple years ago. And it shocked me when I saw it. I said, Lord, what needs to be restored? How far back do we have to go back to the prophets? And what came to my mind was Genesis 1:1, and I thought, what a dumb question to ask, of course. And so I've spent the last number of years studying what it is that needs to be restored. And what needs to be restored is not just the Jewishness of the gospel, even though it is, but it's not Jewish because it didn't derive from the Jewish people. It's what God gave. God designed Israel. It's Godish, not Jewish.
Okay. Wow. So that's so much. I'm learning so much because, of course, I'm not Jewish, or at least that I know of, and so I'm getting a lot of understanding, a lot of history about your culture. Now,
but also, if I can interrupt for a minute, it was originally the culture of the gospel.
Okay.
But after a number of years, Jerusalem was just burned by the Romans. It was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, and everybody fled. And so they started sharing. Well, the believers, there was an estimate of 1 million to 1.5 million Jewish believers in Jerusalem. So the thought that, well, the Jews rejected him. No, the Jews didn't. Some of the leaders did, but the Jews on the whole didn't. But once they were outside of Jerusalem, they started traveling around the Roman Empire and telling people pretty soon what happened is there became more Gentiles than Jews to the faith. And the Gentiles were unaware of what the warnings were in the Torah because they did away with all the Jewish writings. And we wound up with a lot of pagan stuff in the church.
Okay. Wow. See, that's what I mean. Like, there's a lot of deep history that I know I don't know of. So really quickly, well, not quickly, you can take time and expound on this if you want, about the Jewish culture being so rich. Are you able to trace exactly like your lineage or your heritage in your Jewish line?
Well, I have the exciting experience. I'm so glad you asked that question because that's one of my favorite things to talk about, or at least my own private thing. But it's not so private now. We're going to share it with the world on your show. My father told me at one time, my parents became believers also, incidentally, and my brother and a lot of my family after I did. But my father told me that his family were Levites. Go all the way back to Aaron as Levites. And I said, how do you know that? He said, well, my grandfather, who was an Orthodox rabbi, told him, and his grandfather, who was an Orthodox rabbi, told him. And so my daughter has done the 23andMe bloodline that you can check your genealogy. And it goes all the way back. It's Jewish, all the way back, Ashkenazi Jew, all the way back. So there's never been any bloodlines that got any Gentiles that came in there, except maybe 1 or 2 here and there, but over 4,000 years, maybe that's not bad. So when I think about the genes, the DNA that run through my veins, there were ancestors who were there with Abraham. They were there walking to Egypt with Isaac and Jacob, and they were there leaving Egypt. And were they there in the tabernacle? Because the Levites are the ones who took care of the tabernacle. Right. And then they took care of the temple. And so, I've asked the Lord, wherever there are blessings in my genealogy, I want to bring them into my life. And wherever anybody was against God, because who knows, for forgiveness. But I want to take that moment just to say to anybody else who's listening that if you're walking with the Lord today, there's somebody in your genealogy who undoubtedly was walking with the Lord and who were believers. And that God had said to me once, well, sometimes you know that we want to break generational curses of anything that happened, but he said, call in the generational blessings because there are some. So mine happened to be, Godish or Jewish, but they're Godish for everybody I believe we've all had some ancestors that were praying for their family somewhere along the line.
Right. That's very strong. Now, you use a term, and I was trying to remember it in my head while you were talking. It was, I don't even want to say the word, but it was a word you used before you said Jew. I can't even think of the word now, but it was a term describing, I guess, maybe a certain type of Jew.
When I said Godish? Godish? Levites?
It was
well.
No, you were talking about DNA, and you were talking about your great grandfather told his father. You went down the line, and then I don't know if it's like a word for maybe a pure line of Jew.
Of being Levite.
No, does it start with an E?
Don't know what you mean.
We'll stick with Levites. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but it was a word that you used. Maybe when I go back and look at it, then it'll
I bet it was really good too.
Wow, but that is very strong. You said that that if you are a believer right now today, you had somebody in your before you that at some time
your lineage. I mean, we're talking a couple thousand years here, and I really believe that God is faithful. He said unto the 1,000 generations of those who love him and follow him. So even if there's some generations get skipped along the way because somebody was not walking with him as they should be, that we have, all of us can have a right to say, Lord, I want to call in the generational blessings from my family, that we all have that ability.
I agree with that, because so many times you hear people always wanting to break the generational curses, but you can also start calling them in. Start calling in some of your blessings over your family and over your children and over their children, and even where you are right now. So that's very strong. That's very
and for that matter,
I'm going to start.
And send them forward. Lord, wherever the generations come, for children, great-grandchildren, until you come, we ask for the blessings of God to be upon all of my generations.
Right. I agree with that. Now, you have some very interesting things coming up. When I say things, I want to say books. So what I want to do is go ahead and say, please stay tuned, because in our new segment, or our next segment, we're going to go into Lonnie Lane's book that's getting ready to come out. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye.